Chapter 3 The Defector. The evening air hung thick with the scent of damp asphalt and the clamor of honking horns as Daniel Thorne strode down Flatbush Avenue, heading toward the old synagogue. The neon lights of Brooklyn buzzed above him, casting long shadows on the cracked sidewalks. He glanced at his watch. 8:45 p.m. Miriam was supposed to meet him in 15 minutes, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that she wouldn't show. Their meeting at St. Michael's had left him more intrigued than convinced, yet the envelope she gave him contained just enough to pull him deeper into the mystery. Inside were a series of grainy photographs and a hastily scribbled address, 241 Prospect Place. Luther Cain's former campaign advisor, a man named Henry Pritchard, lived there. The synagogue loomed in the distance, a relic from another era, its stone facade weathered and worn. Daniel approached the heavy wooden doors and pushed them open. Inside, Miriam was pacing back and forth, her headscarf pulled tight around her head. She looked up as Daniel entered. "You're late," she said, a hint of irritation in her voice. "Traffic," Daniel replied curtly, shutting the door behind him. "What have you got for me?" Miriam motioned toward the dusty wooden table at the front of the synagogue, where several scrolls lay unfurled alongside religious texts and printed diagrams. "These are additional scrolls from the scrolls of prophecy," she explained. "They all confirm that Luther Cain is the Dajjal foretold in both Christian and Islamic prophecies." She picked up a scroll and pointed to the intricate Arabic script. "He shall traverse the earth with great speed and lay claim to divinity," she translated softly. "But on his forehead, all shall see the mark of the kafir." She then turned to the Bible, her finger resting on Revelation 13:15. "He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause, as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed." "So what does this mean?" Daniel asked, scanning the scrolls. "It means Cain will enforce worship of his image," Miriam replied, "through digital means or something more sinister. He will deceive the world into following him." Daniel nodded thoughtfully, then pulled out the address from the envelope. "And what about Pritchard?" he asked. "A defector," Miriam said, her tone shifting. "He was one of Cain's closest advisors during his campaign, but he left after discovering what Cain was planning." "Which is?" Miriam hesitated before replying. "The mark of Cain." Pritchard saw the early prototypes of a digital identity system that Cain's team developed. Once implemented, it'll bind every person to Cain's global network. "And he just walked away?" Daniel asked skeptically. "Not exactly. Cain's people tried to silence him, but he managed to escape. He's been in hiding ever since." Daniel glanced at the address again. "And he's willing to talk to me?" "If you can earn his trust," Miriam replied. "But be careful. Cain's reach is long, and his people are everywhere." The brownstone at 241 Prospect Place was dimly lit, the front steps littered with yesterday's newspaper. Daniel climbed the stairs and rang the buzzer. A voice crackled through the intercom. "Who is it?" "Daniel Thorne, New York Chronicle," he replied. "Miriam al-Said sent me." A long pause followed, then the door clicked open. Inside, the brownstone was cramped and smelled of dust and mothballs. Henry Pritchard stood at the end of the narrow hallway, his gaunt frame casting a shadow against the dim light. He had the look of a man who hadn't slept in days. "Miriam told me you'd come," Pritchard said, leading Daniel to a small living room cluttered with papers and half-empty coffee cups. He offered Daniel a seat and then quickly drew the blinds. "Is she all right?" he asked, wringing his hands nervously. "She's fine," Daniel replied. "But she's worried Cain's people are after you." Pritchard let out a bitter laugh. "Worried? Cain's people are everywhere. You can't imagine what that man is capable of." "Try me," Daniel said, pulling out his notepad. "Start from the beginning." Pritchard took a deep breath and began. "I was Cain's campaign advisor for 4 years. We were a tight-knit team, working tirelessly to build his image and craft his message. I believed in him. I thought he was a visionary, but everything changed when he became obsessed with the New Dawn." "The New Dawn?" "A global movement Cain envisioned," Pritchard explained. "He wanted to unite the world under a single banner, his banner. Peace and progress for all, he called it. But it wasn't about peace, it was about control." Pritchard pulled out a tattered folder and handed it to Daniel. Inside were diagrams, memos, and photographs detailing Cain's digital identity system. "This is the mark of Cain," Pritchard said grimly, "a digital identity system that will track every aspect of people's lives, where they go, what they buy, who they associate with, and only those with the mark will be able to participate in society."
Daniel flipped through the folder, his stomach churning. The documents detailed a global surveillance network that seemed straight out of a dystopian nightmare. "Cain wants to mark everyone," Pritchard continued. "But it's not just about surveillance. He's planning something much worse." "What?" Daniel asked. Pritchard lowered his voice and leaned closer. "He's preparing for the second seal." "The second seal?" Daniel echoed, confused. "From the Bible," Pritchard said. "The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. The second seal represents war." Pritchard pointed to a map on the wall, showing red pins marking key cities around the world. "Cain is orchestrating a series of geopolitical conflicts that will plunge the world into chaos. He wants to bring the world to its knees so that people will beg for his leadership." "And the mark?" Daniel asked. "A means of control," Pritchard replied. "A way to ensure loyalty and suppress dissent. Once the chaos begins, those without the mark will be cast out, unable to buy or sell, and left to fend for themselves." "But why are you telling me all this?" Daniel asked. "Why not go public yourself?" Pritchard's expression turned fearful. "I've tried," he said, "but Cain's people got to me first. They threatened my family, and I've been on the run ever since." "And now?" Daniel pressed. "Now," Pritchard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just want to stop him before it's too late." Daniel left the brownstone hours later, his mind swirling with Pritchard's revelations. As he walked down the empty street, he felt a strange sense of isolation creeping in. He wasn't a religious man, but the prophecies that Miriam and Pritchard spoke of echoed eerily in his mind. He turned the corner and noticed a figure leaning against a lamppost, staring directly at him. Their eyes locked for a moment before the stranger turned and disappeared into the darkness. Daniel quickened his pace, the envelope of evidence clutched tightly in his hand. The city seemed to close in around him, every shadow hiding an unseen threat. "Cain's people are everywhere," Pritchard's voice echoed in his mind. When he finally reached his apartment, he bolted the door and collapsed onto his couch, staring blankly at the ceiling. His phone buzzed with a new notification, and he looked down to see another news alert about Cain's latest rally. He knew he needed to confront Cain, but he also needed to understand the man better. So he made a decision. The next morning, he emailed Cain's press team, requesting an interview. The lobby of Cain's campaign headquarters buzzed with activity as Daniel arrived, dressed in his best suit and clutching his notepad. He checked in with the receptionist, who promptly led him up to the top floor. Luther Cain's office was minimalist and sleek, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a stunning view of the city skyline. Cain sat behind a glass desk, his piercing gaze fixed on Daniel as he entered. "Mr. Thorne," Cain greeted warmly, rising to shake his hand. "A pleasure to finally meet you." "Likewise," Daniel replied, though he struggled to hide his skepticism. Cain motioned for Daniel to sit, then leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I hear you're working on a piece about my campaign," Cain said. "How can I help?" "I'd like to understand your vision," Daniel began, pulling out his notepad. "You speak a lot about peace and progress, but how do you plan to achieve that?" Cain smiled, his good eye twinkling. "Control, Mr. Thorne," he replied smoothly. "Control and unity." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Control?" "Not in the authoritarian sense," Cain clarified, "but in the sense of guiding humanity toward a common goal. For too long, we've been divided by petty politics, religion, and borders. My vision is one of unity, where everyone works together for the greater good." But doesn't that infringe on individual freedoms? Daniel pressed. What about free will? Cain leaned forward, his gaze intensifying. Free will, he said, almost mocking. Free will is an illusion, Mr. Thorne. People believe they have control over their lives, but in reality, they are slaves to their desires, their fears, their impulses. He stood and began pacing the room, his voice growing more fervent. People need structure, guidance, a strong hand to lead them. They don't know what's best for them, but I do. Daniel scribbled notes furiously, sensing a glimpse of Cain's true nature. So you believe that people should give up their free will for the greater good? He asked. Cain stopped pacing and turned to Daniel. I'm offering them peace, Mr. Thorne, he said softly. A world without hunger, without poverty, without war. But to achieve that, they must trust me, follow my lead. The mark of Cain will ensure that unity. And those who refuse? Daniel asked, already knowing the answer. Cain's smile faded. There will always be dissenters, non-believers, those who cannot see the light. They will have no place in my new world. A chill ran down Daniel's spine, but he pressed on. And where does your morality come from, Mr. Cain? Cain returned to his desk and sat down, his expression thoughtful. My morality comes from control, Mr. Thorne, he replied. Control and the greater good. What about you? Where does your morality come from? Daniel hesitated, his mind racing. He had always believed in free will, in the ability of people to choose good over evil. But now, for the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt. Free will, he said finally, and faith in God. Cain studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. Faith, he repeated, almost wistfully. A curious concept, one that blinds people to reality. But I respect your conviction. He leaned back in his chair and clasped his hands. Mr. Thorne, I believe our conversation has run its course, he said. If you have any further questions, my team will be happy to assist. He stood and extended his hand. Daniel shook it reluctantly, feeling the icy grip of Cain's fingers. Thank you for your time, Daniel said, trying to mask his unease. As he left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stared into the eyes of something far more sinister than a politician. Daniel returned to his apartment that night, his mind clouded with questions. He poured himself a whiskey and sat down with the Bible Miriam had given him, flipping to Revelation 13. The mark of the beast, he muttered, scanning the passage. Control and the greater good. He felt a growing unease as he read the verses, the words blurring together. He wasn't a religious man, but he couldn't ignore the parallels between the prophecy and Cain's vision. As he poured himself another drink, he thought back to his conversation with Cain. Free will and faith in God, he whispered, trying to convince himself. But as he closed the Bible, he couldn't help but wonder if faith alone would be enough.